Well, I think that we are on time. Yes. So welcome everybody. I hope we are all very well with a lot of motivation and energy for our third day of conference. Today, I am the chair of the panel. So first of all, um, I would like to remember you that today we have simultaneous translation, so you can choose the language of your preference. Our first activity today is a workshop exchange. In line with the embodied approach of this conference, we would like to get in touch with your experience of the workshops that you attend yesterday. So we will explore your experience through a self-observation activity. Please make yourself comfortable and return to the workshop experience in which you participated. If it makes it easier for you, you can close your eyes and come in contact with your breath and take a while for getting contact with the experience of the workshop yesterday. Take a minute for that. Come in contact with your breath and come back to the experience of the workshop yesterday. So become aware of whatever is happening in you through the course of the workshop. How you feel at the beginning, what is happening during the course of the workshop, paying attention to all the signs that are emerging in your body. Sounds, images, sensations. Stay there for a while, re-experiencing the workshop that you attended yesterday. Stop at a moment that especially calls your attention. And stay for a few minutes exploring that moment with all your senses. Allowing the sensations to emerge that make that particular moment something special. How is it? What makes it special? How does that feel? special. What body signals come with that feeling? Maybe sounds, images, movements, muscle tones, or others. Spend a few more minutes exploring that special moment, tasting the moment, feeling that moment. Welcome any sensation that comes re-experiencing that special moment. So now you can slowly come up here and now. Good. So I invite you to share a word, an image, or sensation, a single one that is the particular aspect that you get in contact, going back to the experience of the workshop yesterday. Please share with us a word, an image, or sensation that you think is the best form of express what it was, how it was. So if you want, you can raise your hand and begin to share your experience. Okay, Katarina.
For me was connection, deeply connection.
Okay, thank you. Deeply connection. For Catalina, this is the word that came to you with that experience, connection. Who else? Thank you, Catalina. Let me see if any other, maybe at the chat you can, because I don't have everybody in my screen. Okay, Pedro. How it was?
For me, the most important thing was getting in contact with another intelligence, I would say, like an intelligence of sensation, which is always underneath narrative intelligence. That was the most important.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Pedro. Another intelligence. Sounds inspiring. Who else? Constanza. Make an effort to explain it out loud. Where are you, Constanza Galvez?
I'm here.
Yes.
Hi. If I had to put an effort on it, I would say maybe my body remember something. When I got to dance, my body did it. I didn't do it. My body did it. So I don't know how to say that in one word. I'm sorry.
Okay, but some memory in your body about dancing.
Yes.
Something that your body made.
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you, Constanza. Somebody else? Valeria.
Yes, for me it was a sense of ease and flow. I think very similar to Constanza's dancing. So everything was in harmony, moving on its own, something like that.
Beautiful. Harmony, flow. Thank you, Valeria. Thank you very much. I am wondering if you went to the same workshop or not. Who else? I don't see. Camila? Okay.
For me, the word that comes is delicacy, something delicate, connection also, and recognition.
Nice. There is some congruence in what you felt, all of you, until now. That's why I think that maybe you went to the same workshop, but it seems that not. Sabine.
Yes, I was actually workshop leader, but I feel really full of gratitude because it was a very beautiful sharing atmosphere. Sharing would be the word.
Good. Good. Nice. And gratitude maybe also. Sharing. Gratitude for share.
Perhaps I?
Yes. Who is
Martina.
I?
Martina.
Martina.
Hello. Yes, the word that comes to me is fluidity. Something like flow, but it's fluidity, no? Like a water who looks for his course, for its course, and sometimes must detend and then go on and so on. It's fluidity.
Wonderful. Something else, someone else, sorry. Alejandra?
I also felt gratitude and also happiness to help others to connect with their sensations, their bodily sensations.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Mm. It's really inspiring to think that by this means, in a digital format, these kind of experiences could be triggered. It's really impressive. Who else? We still have some time. Imani?
Yeah, just in support of what you just said, I felt a lot of surprise, actually, and a lot of unprecedented and vulnerability, a good vulnerability.
Interesting point. You add the vulnerability, and this interesting also. Thank you, Imani. Thank you very much. Is someone else that would like to share? Magali?
Yes, I experienced something unexpected. So there was the word would be surprise and also a break.
Good. Thank you, Magali. Surprise and break. Good.
I'm curious to know in which workshops you were.
Me too.
Maybe we could say.
Yes. It is very sad that the workshops are parallel, but you need to accomplish the time, so it is impossible to make such huge conference with. So if we can to assist to every of them, would be great. Maybe in another conference we could make only workshops. Who else?
Yes, I experienced a deep, I was very, or what came to me was being very moved by the empathy that was conveyed in the workshop. So with that empathy, I actually felt a really large space in and around my belly, which I just realized it was also blue of color.
Beautiful, really beautiful, Willeke. Around her belly and with a blue color of empathy. Beautiful, really beautiful. It seems that maybe it could be possible to make some research with this tool. Not everything is so pessimistic in times of pandemic. Is there any other that would like to share?
Can I just add on what Willeke said? I also felt, and I was quite surprised to feel that when I said recognition before was related to that, how I could feel so much in touch with someone that I didn't know, with a group of people that I never saw before and through the screen. And I felt that deeply as if I knew what that person, I don't know. I felt, yeah, a kind of recognition.
Familiarity?
Familiarity is as if in a very deep level we could have lived very similar things, or of course different, but yeah, I guess empathy will be the word. It was very surprising for me that that could be possible in this kind of format.
Yes, it is. It is. Maybe we can open the discussion, and if someone would like to add something, if had the same experience of other that already shared and would like to add some, the microphone is open in the resting 6 minutes. Laura.
I was also a workshop leader, but I would love to add that I was surprised and gratefully surprised by the deep subtlety and this subtle depth of collective intelligence. What happens when we all collectively connect in this same deepness, no, in the same depth. I don't know how to say that in words, but it's not about me or about you or about my experience or your experience. There is something that happens in that moment of experience that connects us all with some wisdom that we have, collective wisdom.
You are talking about some kind of atmosphere?
Yes, a kind of atmosphere and something that we activate. I don't know, I think Constanza was sharing that your body has this memory that we activate something that we already have there in this atmosphere. We enable conditions of experience that activate this collective intelligence.
Wow. It sounds really, really impressive, because to be able to create an atmosphere that trigger things that have been there, but you were not aware. And by this mean, it's really, really, really impressive. Would you like, Constanza, to add something to what Laura was saying?
I was thinking about it, and I actually think that it was just because I was the camera wasn't filming at me. I felt like I was safe, so in some sort of way. I was just with me, and I kind of felt my partners doing the same thing in their houses and their offices, but I knew that I was I wasn't alone, but this was private in some sort of way, because I was physically alone in my own house. I had the door closed. It was just me and my partners also, but alone. I don't know how to, but in just a second I felt I didn't saw, but I kind of saw, I don't know, but it was like I was in the rehearsal in a dance class 10 or 12 years ago, in just 1 second. I mean, I moved and I felt the floor and the temperature of the floor in my skin, and I moved, and for a second I was 12 years ago dancing, and my partners were also there, just like yesterday my partners were also there moving their body. Just I didn't see them, but I knew they were there. So I believe that the thing was able to experience yesterday, it was because of the format, because of, I mean, not only because of that, of course, but I don't know if I would be able to connect that way if I were actually with the people by my side, because I tried that a couple of months of years ago. I tried that and I couldn't. And yesterday I was able to. And I believe that this format has new ways to present.
To get in.
Yes. So it's also an opportunity. I mean, I miss everybody, and I'm sure that I would love to be able to meet everybody that there was yesterday in the group, but I think that I don't know if I would be, if I don't know how to say this in English, but I don't know. There's interpretation.
Yes, there is interpretation, yes.
Okay. No sé si habría sido capaz de experienciar esto con las personas en vivo.
Sí.
Aun cuando sí de alguna manera sentía que mis compañeros y compañeras también estaban bailando. Pero no me estaban mirando, porque estaba cada uno en lo suyo. Y yo también estaba en lo mío. Y por un segundo pude conectarme con una década atrás en la sala de ensayo con mis otros compañeros, también viviendo esto de manera colectiva pero individual, como eso doble. Sí. Y eso creo que también se dio en parte por el formato, que sea online, que la cámara tiene un radio como una posibilidad de observar, y en el momento en el que la cámara no me estaba mirando, quizás ahí también yo pude conectarme de otra manera. Entonces creo que ofrece algo. Quizás ahí se entiende mejor.
Sí, yo lo entiendo mejor. Gracias, Constanza. Thank you very much. I expect that the translation made a good work. I think it is. But it's really, really wonderful experience that you shared with us, Constanza. Thank you for that. It seems really promising to go forward with this kind of activities in these times. Precisely, to make the opportunity, give the opportunity to people to re-experience in that way, in a deep contact with their bodily experience. It seems really promising. Thank all the leaders of the workshops for these beautiful experiences that you give to all the participants. So now we have to move forward with the conference program. So I have some domestic acts to share with you. There was a change in the program. If you were not aware of that, the break will be between 13 and 13:50 in our local time zone. It means between Thomas and Christine presentations. So the order of the presentations will be first Sabine Koch, then Thomas Fuchs, and finally Christine Caldwell. Each of the panelists will have 13 minutes of presentation, and I will let them know by the private chat when they complete 25 minutes. So we will have 15 minutes for questions at the end of each presentation. So please write your questions to me on the private chat to have them in view beforehand and to optimize the discussion time. If you have questions remaining from the previous days of the conference, or pending from today, remember that you can send them by our email, to our email, for being taken into account for the final discussion at the end of the conference on Friday. Okay. Remember that today we have simultaneous translation, so you can choose the language of your preference. And please keep your microphones quiet. So I'm very glad to introduce Sabine Koch from Aarhus University for Arts and Social Sciences in Germany, head of the program, director of the Research Institute for Creative Arts Therapies. Her research interests are in the area of embodiment and related theoretical approaches such as Enarton, dynamic system theory, ecological approaches, which understand the human condition as based upon its organismic nature by its capacity for self-organization and interactional resonance. She applied this approach in the area of creative art therapies, where music, art, dance, theater, poetry, and play are used for promoting physical, social, and psychological health and body-mind unity. So I'm very happy to introduce you, Sabine. You can
Thank you very much.
start.
Is there a possibility that I share my slides, Maria Isabel?
Yes. The host
is habilitated to share.
Yes.
Okay, great. Then let's see. Can you all see a starting slide that says space and time?
Yes.
I think I need to go to presentation mode.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Good. Great. So I'm very happy to talk to you all today. My presentation will be about embodiment and the dimensions of space-time, gravity, and attachment. And I've put up front these two proverbs. Second one is of Karl Jaspers. The transformation of will into bodily movement is the only place in the world where the magical becomes real. Let's start with Merleau-Ponty. It's always good to start with him because he was saying that what light is for seeing, body movement is for feeling. So he gave body movement a very special place. And he also said that the living body is the place where man is anchored in the world. And thus it's the starting point of our coordinate system. So today I'm going to talk about the dimensions of space from that starting point of our coordinate system, our body, the dimension of time, the dimension of gravity, and the dimension of the other, or the relational dimension. Let's start with space. So the idea behind a research field that's called spatial bias, it's coming from social psychology, and it's preoccupied with dimensional movement and the related meaning. The idea is actually also to be found in philosophy with Ernst Cassirer, who wrote in The Psychology of Symbolic Forms in 1925. Only because we are body, we have space. And the main spatial directions, front, back, up, down, left, right, in visual as well as in haptic space, are concordantly inequivalent. And he means inequivalent in meaning. So each spatial direction has their meaning, their corresponding meaning dimension. He also says the main directions are not interchangeable because each of these directions is coupled to specific organ sensations. each of these has a specific feeling value tied to it. So this is beginning of last century. And now in contemporary research, for example, Barbara Twersky's research at the University of Stanford in the United States, she is also finding that the body is actually the point that lays the ground for the spatial directions, and then the spatial directions and space is actually the ground for us to form our concepts and express them in language. So this is a summary slide of all the different empirical results that have been found in this spatial bias area of research about movement directions and meaning, which also, of course, lays the ground for metaphorical movement. So it's also very much tied to movement metaphors and the theory of Lakoff and Johnson. So the body has been found, and movement directions have been found in empirical research for the up direction, that it's connected to power and success. These experiments have been done with Stroop tasks mainly, so they are often laboratory experiments, but there are also a couple of field experiments that I will point out. So the dimension of moving upwards is connected to power and success. Moving downward is connected to subordination and defeat, but also to sadness and helplessness, so the feeling, the emotional dimension. Whereas moving upward is connected to the happy feelings and the good feelings. So also an evaluation dimension where the good is more up and the bad is more down. So this is about this first axis, the vertical axis, which is actually the second axis. We'll come to that. And then we have the sagittal movement axis. So we can move to the front and we can move to the back. And this moving to the front is related to the future. And moving to the back is more or less related to the past. And this is very interesting because we have research that shows that this is not universally the same. So it's interculturally different. There are cultures that actually live with the past in front of them and the future in their back. We have a beautiful research by Rafa Nunez. He's Chilean, by the way. Who did a study, not only experimental studies, but also gesture analyses around this phenomenon of the future and the past and the sagittal dimension. And he found in an Indian culture in the north of Chile that when he looked at the gestures there as compared to Westerners gesturing, that people would gesture the other way around. So whereas a Westerner would say next year and gesture to the front, can you see me? And say last year and gesture to the back. In that culture, people were gesturing to the back when they said next year, and they were gesturing to the front when they said last year. So he actually said they are living with their ancestors, facing their ancestors, and the future is actually moving this way for them. So we also have hints that this is true for places in China with the research of Lera Boroditsky. So this is very interesting, because whereas the vertical movement dimension seems to be quite universal, the sagittal movement dimension is more culture bound. And we also have evidence that in Western cultures, the movement direction of moving back is related to being undecided, to being more introvert, to being more controlled, whereas moving to the front is more related to being extrovert, being decided. And also, again, we have this evaluation dimension where moving to the front is more positively connotated and moving to the back is more negatively connotated in the Western world. And then we have evidence from other research studies about the horizontal movement dimension. So that's moving left to right in this way, which is actually the first movement dimension that we acquire in the course of our lives. And we have long thought that there was no bias there, but there are two types of biases. The natural bias, which is connected to our handedness, where the dominant hand is connoted more positively than the non-dominant hand. Also, there are cultural phenomena, of course, because in white places in Africa, you are eating with your right hand and you're going to the toilet with your left hand. So there's a big evaluative bias just due to the use of the hands, for example. And then we have a cultural bias with the horizontal dimension, where it's about writing directions. In the Western world, where we write from left to right, we basically project the future also in the right direction, and we project the past on the other side. But in cultures where you write from right to left, there you would project the future into the other side. And Anne Maas has been doing very interesting studies with Arabs and Italians and Arabs living in Italy for a control group that is in the middle somewhere. And she found that bias of the future being represented in the writing direction. And this also has interesting implications, for example, in the realm of advertisement, where in the Arab countries, they try to implement washing powder advertisement, advertising the washing powder, the dirty washing on the left-hand side, and then the washing powder in the middle, and then the clean washing on the right-hand side. And nobody would buy that washing powder in the Arab world, because of course you needed to put the two washing staples in the different replacement in order for them to not make it look that your washing in the end is dirty when you are actually taking it out of the washing machine, right? So this is very interesting with the spatial bias. So we learned that all these movement directions, moving up, breathing in, bulging the chest, is related to, for example, pride. We have Charles Darwin, who has been beautifully describing this already in his book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. So here's the research, the empirical research for it. And it's very interesting what we learn about embodiment and how the body is actually the ground for metaphors and for language in the end. What we also see when we compare this to linguistic research of the last century, we know that Osgood, Sushi, and Tannenbaum were doing their semantic differential work, where they were trying to find out underlying meaning dimensions of all languages in the world. They were doing this with factor analyses and using all the dictionaries they could find and all the adjectives in the dictionary. So they had hundreds and thousands of adjectives, and they came up with 3 dimensions of meaning, which is the evaluation dimension, which is good versus bad, or comfortable versus uncomfortable, all these words. And then they found as a second dimension, the potency dimension, which is dominant versus, for example, submissive, and powerful versus powerless. And they found the action dimension, which is the third dimension of the adjectives. And the action dimension can be related to the sagittal. So we could relate these meaning dimensions that they found in language with the meaning dimensions of the body. And that could give us a hint that our language is actually based on our embodiment in the world. And so there are several hints from these researches that the body is the base also for concepts, language, and the other cultural acquirements. But these are not the only dimensions. And also, you know, there are phenomenologists such as Erwin Strauss, who said that when the body is in movement and is dynamic, that then we need to look whether these dimensions can still be found, because something else is happening when you go into a dynamic with the body. And also, there is a more basic dimension in terms of movement directions and the body, and it's the dimension of moving inward and moving outward. So inside of the body and out of the body, which is actually before, developmentally before, you know, moving in any directions in space. Can you all understand me well? Okay, good. So Thomas Fuchs was putting forth a taxonomy, and he said these 2 dimensions, moving into the body and out of the body, are really important on the basis. And a couple of other people have looked at that. as well. And he calls them centrifugal body directions and centripetal body directions. And the centrifugal ones are the ones that are expansive, expulsive, explosive, emanative, and so forth. And the centripetal ones are the reflexive, the retentive, the repulsive, the receptive qualities. So, and it's gonna be really interesting to look at, you know, I mean, let me go back. A couple of people are doing very interesting research with language and words that go or move from the inside of your, of this part of your body to the outside or the other way around, because there are vowels that are more up front and there are vowels that are more back there. Very interesting. Sasha Topolinsky, if you want to check that out. And also, I have your name here, Maria Isabel, because you had the idea to use the inside and out of the body with eating disorder and looking at eating disorder in a different way with a phenomenological theory in the background. And I think that's a very, very good idea because it could be a really useful theory in order to get further with helping the eating disorder patients. All right. So let's look at time. Time is the next dimension I wanted to talk about. So time. So this is just another slide to point out that Thomas Fuchs has been looking at the psychopathology of time. And I think, and I hope that he's going to talk about this in his presentation in just a few moments. But let me talk a little bit more about coming from maybe what Maxine Sheets Johnson is telling us in her 1999 book, that our world of experiences does not consist of object, but of dynamics and changes. So all the time we're experiencing these qualities in our surroundings. And they are, of course, closely related to time. And she says, movement is indeed the mother of all cognition. That's her quoting Husserl. It forms the I that moves before the I that moves forms movement. So it's a very early thing. And there's all these dynamics that also Daniel Stern has been talking in his vitality dynamics that he's been putting forth. So there, you could say that there's intrasubjective time. So within our own bodies, there are rhythms and rhythm synchronization within our own bodies. You could also call that a certain self-synchrony. So when I talk, I also gesture with my talk and I make the pauses at the moment, or I finish, or I'm pausing with my talk and my gesturing goes on in order to indicate some other word that might come up. So there's a certain self-synchrony and rhythms that we use within our body. And then there's also intersubjective time. So there's a certain coordination with other bodies in interpersonal rhythms synchronization, interactional synchrony, and so forth. So this is a movement system I'm going to talk briefly about. It's called the Kestenberg Movement Profile, and it tells us about these movement rhythms that develop from within the womb when we are not yet born, and that indicate certain needs and certain affects from ourselves that we have in our bodies. And you know, when if the caregiver is sensitive to these needs, of course, there can be a very successful communication between a small child that can't speak yet and is expressing themselves in these movement rhythms. And so yes, this is Judith Kestenberg, who said there are all these dynamics going on, there are all these adjectives, and children may be more low or more high intensity with their rhythms. They may be more gradual or more abrupt with their rhythms. And Stern is actually echoing this in his 2012 book, where he talks about vitality affects, and he says this is the timeline and this is the intensity of the movement, and we can actually write these movement qualities that we experience in this way with these graphs that Judith Kestenberg has already been talking about in the 50s of the last century. So this is really good. We know now that there's a way to also visualize and talk about these qualities that we may experience in, or that we all experience in these, particularly when we're not yet having language, but of course also ongoing when we have acquired language. So this is Judith Kessberg, this is her system, and the rhythm system is only one of 9 actually profiles how we look at movement in the system. So there are other very interesting dimensions of how we look at movement in the system. I can't go into those, and don't make me go into those because I'm gonna talk forever. I can talk about this for hours. So just to let you know, the basic dimensions that she conceptualizes is the qualities of movement. The rhythms belong to the qualities of movement, and it's more in the interpersonal system. And then the movement shape, and the movement shape is on the other side of the system, on here on the right-hand side with 4 of the perspectives. And that's more about how we connect to our environment, to objects in the environment, but particularly also to people in the environment, of course. And that's starting from the breath with growing and shrinking towards other people or away from other people in our movements, with subtle movements, but also with more explicit movements. This is a rhythms curve of a newborn baby where you can keep, you know, in time. So you have a timeline, you make a timeline, you use your hand to write the tension flow changes in the body of the observed child. So you're using yourself basically like a seismograph would actually measure, you know, trembling earth. You're using yourself in that way, using your kinesthetic empathy with the body that's moving in front of you, and then bringing these lines down on the sheet of paper and then identifying patterns that are actually coming up from the body movement of, in this case, a small baby of 2.5 months. Yeah, so these are the prototypical rhythms. And I just wanted to point out, I'm not going too much into them, but it's very interesting. So just the oral rhythms, for example, are used when you hug somebody, you might want to, you start with the oral rhythm maybe, and then when the hug is coming to an end, you might change it into the fighting phase of that rhythm, which is the biting rhythm, in order for the other person to let them know that you are actually wanting to separate from them. So that's just as an example of how rich these rhythms are and what they all tell us about our communication with others on the nonverbal area. There are songs that you can directly connect to these rhythms. For example, all the lullabies all over the world are in an oral rhythm so that they actually calm down the kids. They have this very sinus curve-like, very frequent pattern. And okay, and also in art, you can find these rhythms. For example, Van Gogh has a lot of twisting rhythm in his paintings, and that, of course, is also expressing needs. And we have been looking at the communicative power of these rhythms. So we have been doing experiments with communication in these rhythms with a handshake, within a handshake. So we had somebody who was trained to shake the hand, either in a rhythm that is smooth or that has sharp reversals. And then we found out that people would interpret these handshakes in totally different ways. And so they found smooth rhythms were found to indicate more positive affect, but also in terms of personality of the person, more agreeableness, more openness, and more extraversion. Whereas the sharp rhythms were related to more negative affect and also a higher perceived neuroticism in the person that was shaking the hand. And we also worked with embraces. So I was already saying, when you start to embrace somebody, use a smooth rhythm. When you want to indicate you want to separate, you use a sharp rhythm. And we were looking at that experimentally, trying to find out whether this theory of Kestenberg is actually observable. So we first did observations in train stations and in our Commodores, in our where the students eat. Of people saying goodbye, And it was very interesting because already in these field observations, we found out that it was also a big gender questions around the hugs. So the smooth face would be there when two women would hug and when a woman and a man would hug, but it wouldn't be there when two men were actually hugging. So they would start right away with the patting face, with the sharp rhythm face, and wouldn't go into the smooth rhythms face. So that was interesting in and of itself, also really telling in terms of the homophobia that's still around in our society, pretty much. So yes. Oh, and the next dimension, I'm coming to the next dimension, that's gravity. Maria Isabel, how much time do I have left? 1 minute? Oh, okay, that's good. Now, gravity is about I, myself, and me. And that's when the child moves into, you know, first walking or first standing up and experiencing the gravity in the body. And that's where actually children move around the age of 2 into this place where they are contradicting you all the time, because it's the first place where they experience their own weight, their I, it's me, that's me. So you get this stubbornness. And of course, gravity is very important in diseases. So if you feel depressed, you feel a much higher gravity subjectively. And dancing can hopefully also alleviate and help against this pull down to gravity. So really briefly, because I don't have much time left, I really wanted to go into the relational dimension in the end of my talk. So there's Georg Kafka, who was talking about the Uraffekte. Basically, he conceptualized affects, basic affects, in terms of relations. And he said, there is love and affection, and it's in terms of movement, along with me to you. So it's a pull. And then there's ingestion, along with you to me, which is in desire and greed. And then there's away with me from you, which is in fear and disgust. And then there's away with you from me, which is in anger and hatred. So anger is actually the only approach emotion where I actually go closer to somebody. So that's also interesting in and of itself. And my last point I want to make is that I think our human dimension, after all these spatial, time, and gravity dimensions, is the dimension of love and attachment, actually. And we're finding out at the moment that attachment styles are correlated with many, not only psychopathologies, but also really other health issues and health problems that are medical health issues and problems. We're also finding out that mirroring in movement is an embodiment of attachment. So the more secure a person is attached and their attachment style, the freer this person is actually able to mirror. And then I had brought a movie example, which I don't go into, but I'm giving you a recommendation because there's a science fiction, Interstellar, that is really actually beautifully talking about these dimensions and also putting the dimension of love as a bridge in the end, in order to save the world, of course, because it's a Hollywood movie. But anyway, it's very good to watch because it has this thought of attachment and love being our human dimension that can actually surmount time, space, and gravity and go beyond it. Where have I already read that? Where have I already read that? I've read that in a book of Varela and Maturana, I think. Who are coming to a similar point in their final chapter. They're talking about love at the final stage of their dynamic systems theory of knowledge, actually. So going with them, I want to end with a quote. This is my last slide, Maria Isabel. I'm sorry, I'm going over time. I want to end with their quote around that. Biology also shows us that we can expand our cognitive domain. This arises through a novel experience brought forth through reasoning, through an encounter with a stranger, or more directly, through the expression of a biological interpersonal congruence, that lets us see the other person and open up for him or her room for existence beside us. This act is called love, or if we prefer a milder expression, the acceptance of the other person beside us in our daily living. And I just want to point out that Hanne de Jager is actually doing some beautiful research on the phenomenon of love from the phenomenological side at this point in time. So if you want to check out more, go to Hanne de Jager. And this is it. Thank you all for your attention. I'm looking forward to discuss this with you.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for your really, really impressive presentation. There is a lot of activity in our chat. So I will begin with the question of Sebastian. Maybe Sebastian, would you like to make your question out loud? Yes or not, or I can read it for you. Yes. Sebastian asked about how do these spatial biases relate to the tribes such as Gugu, Dimitir, and Kut-Tayore, I'm not sure I'm spelling well, which don't use the bodily, egocentric, spatial coordinates, but as a culture, from their childhood onwards, use the geocentric absolute coordinates. For example, they use north, south, west, and east. They use it flawlessly and from early childhood onwards. So they don't talk about left, right, and front, back, but those cardinal coordinates. This is his question.
Yeah, I'm just rereading it in order to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, these tribes bed, which don't use the bodily egocentric spatial coordinates, but as a culture from the childhood on the geocentric. Well, I think it should go the same way, right? It doesn't really matter if you call it up, down, or front, back, or if you call it north, west, east. Maybe if there are less or more coordinates in that way, because north, south, west, east are only 4, and we have 6 in the spatial dimensions because of the, horizontal, vertical, and sagittal domain, then that would make a difference because there are less dimensions. But otherwise, I would think that it doesn't really matter how you call them, because it's the body from, seen from our 0 point of our coordinate system, and then the movement from the body in these directions. And it shouldn't really matter how you call them.
No, the thing is that when they talk about anything that has to do with space, they wouldn't say things like, could you pass the cup that is on the right? They would say, could you pass the cup that is on the south? And it would depend on where they're oriented, what they would say. So for them, it's not like they actually, the way they talk about space is in a way that omits the bodily moment, and they basically focus on the capital coordinates. So for example, it would be different if we were to stand like this, or if we were to stand like this. They would say, pass me something with regards to it wouldn't be the body that would be the anchor, but the south would be the anchor, or the north would be the anchor. And for example, they even have things like when you meet someone and the first thing they ask you as a salute is, where are you going? And if you don't know how you're oriented, you can't even answer the fundamental question, because you have to answer something like, I'm going north, south, or northwest, or something like that.
Oh, interesting. And they wouldn't have. Do you know whether they have something like a body-oriented also expression in a way?
Yeah, for example, they would be able to say things like something is on your left arm, or something like that. But whenever they have any expressions whatsoever with regards to the spatiality, they basically use the cardinal coordinates. So they don't use the what they sometimes call egocentric coordinates.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay.
Thanks for that contribution, Sebastian.
Yes. There is another question about from Constanza Galvez. She asked about what does research show when bodies go through some drastic change, such as in pregnancy or in transit after gender affirmative surgery? Big question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think particularly that we need to do much more research about pregnancy. And I've not seen a lot, you know, particularly from a phenomenological perspective. Maybe there are things. I know a really good work of art therapy where they have actually had 6 women draw layers of changes of their bodies while they were pregnant in a phenomenon, in an impressionistic way, let's say. So in an art expression, and they were actually doing these and putting them on transparent sheets of paper and putting them one over the other in the end. So it's really beautiful. It's a doctoral thesis from Drexel University. And I haven't seen a lot of other works, but I think we really need to go there and the changes, drastic changes in the body, and how does that impact our experience? Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sabine. Ivan Vial has another question. He said that he's very interested in the idea of vitality affects to understand interpersonal coordination. However, vitality affects describe micro changes in attunement. So his aim is to explore the possibility of understanding the whole process of interpersonal coordination as structured by a general resonance of our basic feeling of feeling alive or vitality. So I don't know, what would you like to say to that, Sabine? It's a nice...
Is it in the chat, Maria Isabel? I think I need to reread it in order to find...
Okay. Do you have it?
Can I...
Yeah, why don't you talk, yes. Ivan? That's much better. Let's talk.
Yeah, my idea is that I agree with your presentation in the part of vitality affects, but I wonder, I think that vitality affects seem to describe, for example, microdynamics like pulsing or bursting in Stern's account. However, I think it is so, it is an affective vocabulary that is so rich that I think it could be expanded to understand the general process of interpersonal coordination.
Oh, wow.
So my hypothesis or general hypothesis is that IC is sustained by a sharing of the feeling of being alive itself, and vitality affects being its modifications or particular changes. And my question was, do you think it is rather nonsensical, or does it have, do you have any references or something to think about this? Because it's really important.
I really think that, yes, that this is about being alive, and you can do a lot with it, because that's, I mean, that's the pure sensing, right? I would totally agree. And I have the 2 references I have are Daniel Stern and Judith Kestenberg for this. And they were really both, I guess, and particularly Judith Kestenberg was a genius in, you know, collecting these experiences and observing small children also, and trying to, and also, of course, Stern. I mean, they were both really great in doing this, you know, just going into these places and describing that. And Kestenberg did really develop this system from it that makes a lot of sense. So she's trying to actually put a theory, come up with a theory system that would allow us to, you know, also categorize and use it in another way. But you know, I mean, you don't necessarily need to do that, but it's very helpful for us to do in movement therapy, to do to get ideas about where actual problems of the patients lie within the diagnosis that they get, because diagnoses are big categories, but movement can be observed so much more elaboratedly. And so it helps us a lot in clinical work with patients to look through the glasses of the rhythms observations, of the quality observations, and to exchange with the patient and to go from there. And it's good to have this also as a developmental system, because it gives you ideas where the patient could possibly move next in order to, you know, come to a fuller vitality.
And do you think that when people coordinate in some way, they are sharing their stimul, their basic attunement to the world, or is it too far-fetched?
When people coordinate, they share their Stimmung. I would say yes. I mean, a Stimmung is shared by resonance, and resonance is made possible by movement synchronization, you know, so I would say yes, yes.
Thanks.
Sure, Eva.
Okay, the last question is from Jorge Soto. I guess that he's not online. I'm not sure
Yes.
if you are, Jorge.
Jorge,
I just reconnected.
Would you like to make your questions by yourself?
Maybe, yeah, thank you. Yeah, the first question was regarding up and down movement, because in some cultures, down is appreciated. It's like a grounding, going down, eventually as in Qigong.
Yes, yes.
So that's one first question. And the second one is about the movement speed, because in some traditions, you are prompted to carry out the same sequence at normal speed, fast speed, and very slow speed. And I guess most people, most of us, are used to carry out what we have to do at the same speed, our usual standard speed. So how do you find this is relevant, this eventually ability to change seamlessly from one speed to another, very different?
Yeah, so addressing your first point with the grounding, of course, grounding is a very positive aspect, and it's going down. And I would agree with you that, you know, it's not a total, we found this bias when we did experimental work, that the upward movement was always more connected to the positive. But of course, you know, that's not like a general thing that it's always the case. So grounding is definitely a very important dimension that's very positive when we look at also clinical work, you know, grounding for patients who experience trauma or dissociation. It's very, very basic. And then the speed question. So you are actually asking whether the variation in the speed would have a positive impact. Am I getting that right? So you say usually we're doing things in one speed, and when we vary, when we start to decelerate this movement, the same movement, or to accelerate the same movement, that's when it's becoming really a new thing, because it's going into new qualities, right? We are using that in movement therapy very actively to go into the quality of deceleration or the quality of acceleration, and to make the patient more flexible in these ways, also with their bodily repertoire, because our thinking is that, you know, when you reach flexibility, more flexibility on the body level, that it also allows you more flexibility on the mental and cognitive level in the end. So, but this is theory. Yeah. Is that answering your question? I don't want to go over time so much, because we're already 3 minutes over, and I am very aware of that. So why don't we, I give it back to you, Maria Isabel.
Thank you, Sabine. Thank you very much. You awake a lot of interest, but we have to move forward. So I am very pleasure and honored to present now Professor Thomas Fuchs from Heidelberg University, Germany. He's psychiatrist and philosopher, and is honored with the status of Karl Jaspers Professor for Philosophy and Psychiatry at the Department of General Psychiatry in the University of Heidelberg. His research areas lie at the intersection of phenomenology, psychopathology, and cognitive neuroscience, with main emphasis on embodiment, enactivism, temporality, and intersubjectivity. So, Thomas, I don't see you, but
I'm here.
You are somewhere.
I'm here. Thank you, Maria, for this nice and kind introduction. It's a bit noisy here. Can you hear me all right? Is it fine? Okay. The room is has a hall, an echo, so to speak, I realized just now. Anyway, perhaps I can, is it okay? Otherwise I shift the room. Is it okay? Fine. Okay, then I share the screen with you. Just a moment. Okay, so my talk will be, well, a bit on a similar route, but will be also a discussion with psychoanalysis. So the question is, how do we make sense of the unconscious, basically? And this pertains to the relation between phenomenology and psychoanalysis, which is a difficult relation. The main reason being their conflicting views about the conscious and the unconscious. So for psychoanalysis, the consciousness is more or less mere a sphere of semblance, a surface which deceives us and conceals the actual forces and processes in the depth of the psyche. Whereas for phenomenology, on the other hand, consciousness is the medium in which phenomena come to be seen, manifest themselves. So consciousness on the one hand as a sphere of mere semblance, or as a sphere of manifestation, which is of course a very difficult, very different concept. And the same contrasting views apply to the unconscious. The unconscious for psychoanalysis is the actual source of the psyche's life, its hidden driving force, whereas the unconscious for phenomenology cannot be seen as more than an implicit awareness, which remains in principle accessible to consciousness. To quote Husserl, and this at this occasion, what I do not know, what in my experience, my imagination, thinking, doing is not present to me as perceived, remembered or thought, will not influence my mind. And what is not in my experience, be it ignored or implicitly and intentionally decided, does not motivate me even unconsciously. So these two views seem hardly reconcilable. Now, what was the beginning? Freud certainly had discovered a paradoxical truth, namely the ambiguity of consciousness, as manifested, for example, in the well-known Freudian slips, misspeaking, mishearing, intentionally forgetting, etc. So the paradox is, as Freud writes, that one knows something that one simultaneously doesn't know, and that one is struck with blindness while the eyes can see. But Freud was only able to solve this paradox by splitting the psyche into two foreign parts. And as a consequence, the unconscious turned into an internal foreign country, as something within oneself, which is alien to the subject. The ego is not master in its own house, as the famous sentence goes. Now, the phenomenological critique of this concept moved along various paths. I will only mention two of them. Sartre conceived the unconscious not as something outside the subject, but as a basic modality of the subject's relation to himself, namely the relation of bad faith or mauvaise foi, which means that the subject assumes an ambivalent relation to himself, sliding or letting himself slide into an intentional inattention. So one doesn't know something and one doesn't want to know it. One doesn't see something and doesn't want to see it. And by this becomes the deceiver and the deceived in one. Now, second, there is the possibility of taking the ambiguity of the lived body as the starting point, as Merleau-Ponty did. And then it becomes possible to encounter the unconscious in everyday behavior, in the bodily behavior, in the day-to-day living, and in the structures of a person's lived space. And then this wouldn't be an unconscious in some unknown depths of the psyche. It wouldn't be an unconscious in the vertical dimension, but it would be an unconscious in the horizontal dimension of the lived body and of our relation to others. And for this, implicit or body memory plays a special part, plays a special role, as we will see. And this second possibility is which I will follow in my talk. So the question will be, can the unconscious be localized in the lived relationships and behavior of a person, in the horizontal dimension of the lived body and intercorporeality? In what follows, I will first want to develop the concept of body memory, and then look for the lived space that surrounds the body, so to speak, the field of relations that it constitutes. And then I will look at the structures of this field where the unconscious can be found, so to speak. Now, if we regard the body not as the visible, touchable, physical body, but rather as our capacity to see and to touch and to sense, then body memory denotes the totality of these bodily capacities, habits, dispositions, as they have developed in the course of one's life. So through repetition of experiences, a habit structure has formed. Well-practiced patterns of movement and perception have been embodied as skills or capacities that we apply in our everyday lives as a matter of course. But body memory does not direct ourselves or take ourselves back to the past. It rather enacts the past without conscious remembering. And therefore, it may also be called implicit memory. So the lived body is the ensemble of acquired and organically developed capacities to perceive, to act, to desire, and to communicate. Its experiences, anchored in body memory, cover the environment like an invisible network which relates us to things and to other people. It is important to note that what is mediated by body memory is mostly forgotten in terms of explicit memory. And an example which I like very much is the capacity of typewriting, which is a memory in the fingers, which is unavailable for explicit knowledge. So if you're able to typewrite, you could hardly tell which keys correspond to the word, let's say, memory. Where's the M, where's the E, where's the O or R? You would easily find them when once you put your fingers on the keyboard, and maybe you do that if you try imagining to type the word memory. And if you do that, you can now test whether you have found them. In any case, you immediately realize that there is no conscious memory and no conscious knowledge of where the types, of where the keys are, but the knowledge is in your fingers. This is a general characteristic of body memory. Now, body memory does not only relate to objects and things we deal with, but also to others. In the structures of bodily experience, and particular in bodily resonance, the others are always already included. Before I reflect on what I communicate, my body already has established a relation, a resonance with others. And this intercorporeality comprises the self and the others, the conscious and the unconscious. As Merleau-Ponty writes, I do not have to search very far for others. I find them in my experience. They are lodged in the hollows that show what they see and what I fail to see. So we are in no way locked inside ourselves. Now, body memory thus forms a system which is not restricted to the physical body. It also constitutes a sensory motor, emotional, and interactive field in which we constantly move and behave. So what offers itself here is the terminology of Kurt Lewin, a famous German psychologist of the first half of the 20th century. Kurt Lewin's field psychology, particularly the concept of the life space, with its center in the lived body. And I want to give a brief outline of this concept of the topological or field psychology. The lived space or life space is the totality of the space that a person pre-reflectively inhabits and experiences. It is centered around the person and the person's body. It is further characterized by qualities such as closeness versus distance, wideness, narrowness, connection or separation, attainability, and so on. And this produces more or less, and it is also structured by physical or symbolic boundaries, which offer some kind of resistance to free movement. And this produces more or less clearly delimited domains, such as the peripersonal space around one's own body, or claimed territories, one's property, one's home, spheres of influence, or also prohibited zones or taboo zones. All kinds of qualitative domains. The lived space is further permeated by field forces, for example, attraction, repulsion. Competing forces, so to speak, and such conflicting attractive or repulsive forces lead to typical conflicts, such as attraction versus aversion, attraction versus attraction, etc. And they can be considered as conflicting directions of movement or possibilities which offer themselves to a person in a given situation. Moreover, the life space is also characterized by effects of gravitation, radiation, or even by curvatures of space. A good example of such conflicting field forces and curvatures is offered by the situation of a small child in vicinity to her mother or his mother. And the child is torn back and forth between his bond to his mother and curiosity for exploration of the environment. So first, the mother is the safe haven, the center of gravity, so to speak, which curves the child's experience space in such a way that the child remains rather in her vicinity. So the space acquires a gradient. If the child moves away from the mother, then the more distant he is from the mother, the more empty and the more lonely the space becomes. It may condense around other strange people again, but here the child will rather make a detour around them, so the space is negatively curved around them. Little by little, the child's exploratory drive loses his ties to his mother, so it becomes increasingly possible to increase the distance against the gradient, but only to the point where the bond is stretched too much and the child runs back to his mother in the end. So I think this nicely illustrates what is meant by field forces, gravitation, and so on. And this example is also a good illustration of the fact that the field structures are based on body memory. In this case, the history of the experiences the child has had in closeness and security with his mother. So attachment research has shown this in detail. So from birth on, body memory incorporates and extracts typical experiences with others, and thus acquiring dyadic patterns of interaction, or what Daniel Stern has called schemes of being with. Another interesting and proverbial example of body memory lies in the saying, the burnt child dreads the fire. At least that's the German proverb. In English, it's once bitten, twice shy, which illustrates a negative or aversive effect of body memory, in this case, pain memory, which leads to a mostly unconscious implicit avoidance of similar situations. And the third example, finally, is given by zones of prohibition and interdiction, which restrict the child's movements so that his spontaneous impulses interfere with the parental imperatives. So they also have left a negative gradient on the life space of the child. So we see that the life space, depending on the respective experiences of a person, can carry various significances and relevances, gravitational effects, curvatures of space, barriers, and so on. Particularly in psychopathology, we encounter various alterations of the lived space. For example, the zones of avoidance in anxiety disorders, or the taboo zones, the zones of impurity in OCD and obsessive patients, which are based on certain past experiences and have sedimented in body memory. Now, this is a brief sketch of a concept which also allows us to conceive the unconscious in a different way. If we reject Freud's idea of a separate unconscious below subjectivity, then the unconscious might be found not in the vertical dimension, in the depth of the psyche, but, as I already said, in the horizontal dimension of the lived body and the lived space. And such an unconscious would be found not in our innermost sphere behind the back of consciousness, but before us as the structure of our field. It would be the unrecognized reverse side of our embodied being towards the world. Sorry. Müssen Sie hier rein? Wann beginnt es? Muss das jetzt sein? Sorry, I have to change places. Ja, das ist wirklich blöd.
Okay, Thomas, no problem. We'll wait for you. If you want, you can shut your screen.
Difficult times. Okay. Just a moment. Now, as a starting point, let me consider the field structure of a repressed wish. In his short story, The Brandy Drinker and the Bells of Berlin, Heinrich von Kleist, the German writer, reports the story of an alcoholic soldier who, after insistent preaching and punishment, had solemnly resolved to become abstinent from now on. Yet after only 3 days, he was found completely drunk again. He was asked how this relapse could have happened after all his good resolutions, and the soldier justified himself by saying that the devil must have had his hand in it because while walking through the town, he began to hear the names of various brandies and liquors in the tolling of the bells. Here it is important to know the German names for brandies, which is, for example, Kümmel or Pomeranzen. So he heard the names of various brandies, Kümmel, Kümmel, in the ringing of the town hall bell, and Pomeranzen, Pomeranzen, Pomeranzen. So in the ringing cathedral bell, so in the at low pitch, deeper, and so on. So in the end, he couldn't help being defeated by these insidious sounds, he claimed. Well, this is certainly a rather humorous example, and it relates to a wish which was not actually repressed, but merely suppressed by an act of will. But it gives a fine illustration of the indirect way in which contrary bodily impulses or drives can get their way, namely from the outside. They are heard in the environment. So the experiential field is, so to speak, permeated by a suppressed bodily desire, which finally becomes crystallized in certain perceptions, in this case, in the various tolling of the bells. So the wish was not satisfied, the wish that was not satisfied breaks through by a detour and from the outside. So that in principle, we can already recognize here the mechanism of displacement, Verschiebung. So what is actually desired is fulfilled in the perceptual field through something similar, but less prohibited. A comparable interference of explicit intentions and implicit directions is also found in the various types of Freudian slips: mishearing, misplacing, misspeaking, forgetting, etc. Freud himself says that slips are the result of two different intentions which interfere with one another, of which one can be called the disturbed and the other the disturbing intention. So mishearing is almost like the example of Kleist's soldier. A latently desired meaning is interpreted from a similar sequence of sounds. Similarly, with slips of the tongue, with mislaying or losing things, another intention interferes with the explicitly intended action, so that the right hand literally doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And finally, with forgetting, an unpleasant intention is blanked out and replaced by another one, for example, by routine processes. And thus, in all these cases, a latent intention wins through by spontaneous bodily inaction, in a kind of reversal or a chiasm, which is expressed by the prefix miss. Now, the producer of the slip, the person, can either recognize its significance and ascribe it somehow to himself, or he finds it strange, puzzling, senseless, in other words, alien to himself. And that's what Freud writes. If later we present the intention on which the misspeaking was based to the speaker, he may either acknowledge it as something familiar, so that it was only temporarily unconscious, or he may deny it as alien to himself, which means that it was permanently unconscious. And it is on this difference that Freud bases a very categorical distinction between the preconscious and the dynamic unconscious, which is repressed or excluded from consciousness by living forces, as he writes. However, the question is, does this really justify establishing a special intrapsychic space for the dynamic unconscious? I think if we do not attribute the living forces of repression to an interpsychic mechanism beyond consciousness, but if we see them rather as dynamic field forces, we will easily find analogies for such repression or avoidance in the lived body and life space. The first thing that comes to mind would be, for example, the relieving posture that we adopt implicitly, unconsciously, after sustaining an injury. Spontaneously, one avoids putting the injured limb at risk from dangerous objects, holds it back without having still to think of the injury of the event. So avoidance behavior is incorporated into body memory. Moreover, I have already mentioned the zones of prohibition, which face the child as a negative field force until the child respects them automatically. We come one step closer to the dynamic unconscious with zones or objects of taboo. Because unlike prohibition, the taboo has a special structure. It is not expressly formulated, but it is generated by the avoidance behavior of others. It works like a negative curvature of the shared life space around what is excluded or prohibited. And taboos are most effective when they are not explicitly declared and the members of the community are not even aware of them.
Thomas, there are 4 minutes resting.
Okay. In all these cases, experience and conduct are determined by negative or repulsive field forces exercising their effect unconsciously. And this avoidance has become an implicit bodily pattern which creates a repulsive space in the lived space, so to speak. Nevertheless, the repelling forces come not from the outside, but as a negativity within experience itself. They are part of the experiential field. And the manifest feelings of fear, guilt, or shame which arise on the stepping beyond the barriers are already latently present both before, and they endow these barriers with their unpleasant affective loading. So this means an ambiguity or duplicity of consciousness itself, in such a way that the subject if she hits on the manifestation of the hidden meaning, at least has a hunch that it means something to her. I've skipped the next slide and turn to another phenomenon, namely the unconscious effect of emotional trauma, which Merleau-Ponty also interprets as an unconscious after effect, which resembles the phantom limb in amputated patients. So it constitutes an empty space of lived subjectivity, so to speak. There is an invisible trace of a past experience which permeates each novel situation unnoticed. The traumatized person becomes hypersensitive to threatening, shaming situations which are somehow similar to the trauma, even if this similarity is not consciously recognized, and he tries to circumvent them. All the same, at every step, the victim may encounter something that reawakens the trauma in her. Often it happens that a permanent predisposition develops to react with fear and nervousness. The effect of the trauma can thus be regarded as a specific alteration of her lived space, an unconscious avoidance of repulsive zones or anxiety-provoking zones. The lived space around these is to a certain extent negatively curved. And lived space is also permeated with similarities through which the trauma approaches the traumatized person from outside. An impressive description of this is found in the memoirs of the Jewish writer Aaron Appelfeld, who from his 7th to his 13th year of age experienced the Second World War, hiding in the woods of Ukraine. And he writes many years later, "More than 50 years have passed since the end of the war. I have forgotten much, even things that were very close to me, places in particular, dates and the names of people. And yet I can still sense those days in every part of my body. Whenever it rains, it's cold, or a fierce wind is blowing, I'm taken back to the ghetto, to the camp, or to the forests where I spent many days. Memory, it seems, has deep roots in the body. The cells of my body apparently remember more than my mind, which is supposed to remember. For years after the war, I would walk neither in the middle of the sidewalk, nor in the middle of the road. I always clung to the walls, always staying in the shade and always walking rapidly as if I were fleeing. Sometimes just the aroma of a certain dish or the dampness of shoes or a sudden noise is enough to take me back in the middle of the war. The war has infiltrated my bones." So here it is not a particular episode, but an entire phase of life which has left its mark on the body. Proprioception, touch, smell, hearing, even certain kinds of weather can suddenly reawake the past, and even bodily patterns of movement, such as the hunted walk close to the wall, still imitates the behavior of the fugitive. To conclude, from the point of view of phenomenology, the unconscious is not an intrapsychic reality located in some depth below consciousness. Rather, it surrounds and permeates conscious life, similar to a picture puzzle where one only sees the foreground but overlooks the important structure in the background. It is an unconscious which is not located in the vertical dimension of the psyche, but rather in the horizontal dimension of lived space, most of all lodging in the intercorporeality of dealing with others, as the hidden or reverse side of intersubjectivity. Unconscious fixations are like certain restrictions in a person's space of possibilities, produced by an implicit but ever-present past, which declines to take part, which refuses to take part in the continuing progress of life. Its traces, however, are not hidden in an inner psyche, but manifest themselves as blind spots or curvatures in the lived space. And thus the unconscious is absence in presence, the unperceived in the perceived, or the reverse side of conscious life. Like a figure which blanks out the ground from which it stands out, thus consciousness, perception, and language conceal their reverse side, the unconscious, the unperceived, the silence, which are nevertheless always bound up with them. This reverse side, however, does not remain fully concealed, but expresses itself in reversals, chiasmatic entanglements, in an ambiguity of consciousness itself. One doesn't know something and does not want to know it, as Sartre said. One overlooks something and doesn't want to see it. Consciousness is not fully accessible to itself because it hides itself from itself. And this duplicity or ambiguity of consciousness corresponds to the ambivalent, contradictory nature of our existence itself, where we, precisely as natural embodied beings, can always confront our own instinctive and natural side as well. We can take a stance towards ourselves. We are kind of divided between the one and the other, and this is what constitutes the contradictory character of our existence. So I think Freud wrongly placed this contradiction or this opposing will within us in a separate chamber of the psyche. The unconscious is ultimately what we are ourselves, precisely as bodily beings. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas. While the people can formulate their questions, I have one. I would like you to refer to the intentionality of consciousness in relation to this horizontal notion of the unconscious. If you think that there is a relationship between these ideas.
Well, there's a relation between the intentionality of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
and the unconscious.
The horizontal idea of unconscious.
Well, the intentionality of consciousness would, of course, be the explicit or conscious directedness, which we have in the focus of our attention, so to speak. So the unconscious would be precisely what is beneath, beyond, or around in the margins of our focused awareness. So intentionality would always be kind of a focus towards something which is in the center of attention, and around or beneath or inside this structure, there is the background structure. So the intention would be precisely what kind of blanks out, what makes the unconscious invisible. We can always only look at the focused parts of the field, the parts on which we focus. But this blanks out what we don't focus on. And if there's in addition a kind of avoidance effective in our attention, so we don't implicitly, we do not want to look at the margin, we do not want to look at the background, then the phenomenon of the unconscious is given or becomes understandable, but it is in the horizontal dimension as kind of the negative side of intentionality. I hope this is a bit more clear.
So maybe it has to do with affective intentionality also.
Yeah, it has to do with affective intentionality, but affective intentionality also would be something that is rather given in the foreground of awareness. So if I experience joy or if I experience anger, then this is not an unconscious phenomenon, at least if it turns up to become intense enough. So it's not an unconscious phenomenon, but it is something in which I'm well aware of. I'm angry at someone or something. So this wouldn't be unconscious. So affective intentionality does not by itself mean that there is a kind of unconscious phenomenon involved. But you might say that there is an unconscious affective intentionality, but the term intentionality is a bit problematic if you apply it to something unconscious. Therefore, I would rather recommend not to talk of an unconscious intentionality. You might take Merleau-Ponty's notion of operative intentionality. That is something he ascribes to the body. That may be a possibility. But the notion of affective intentionality is at least ambiguous, and you would have to define whether you mean it as a conscious feeling towards someone or something, or if it's something implicitly given only.
Thanks. Okay. I have another question from Raúl Cárdenas. He asked me to ask you, would the conscious and the unconscious be the Aristotelian dynamic game of power and act?
Would the conscious and unconscious be the, I didn't get that.
Aristotelian dynamic game of power and act. I will type it in your
of power and act. Okay, actus and potentia.
Yes.
Would that be really parallel? I would be inclined not to parallelize these two pairs of concepts, because my disposition or my power is certainly something which need not be unconscious. I can be well aware of my power to, let's say, stand up and go out of the room. And if I realize this power or this disposition, then there is no shift from unconscious to conscious phenomena. So my potentiality or my dispositions may be unconscious, but they are not necessarily unconscious. So in that sense, the power of Aristotle is not exactly equivalent with the unconscious dispositions. So I would be inclined to be a bit cautious with making the analogy too strict here, too clear here. I think there are differences.
Okay, there is a last question from Jorge Soto. He asked about if does it follows from your approach that you could get a glimpse of somebody's unconscious just by watching him moving?
That one could get a glimpse of an unconscious tendency by watching him move. Yes, why not? A movement could be something where, as the saying goes, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand does. So that would be a perfect example of many Freudian slips. So I'm a certain movement. I have to think of an example. A certain movement could be a movement of declining. So whereas my my conscious awareness is on my words, and my words are inviting, for example. So I invite by my words because that is my conscious focused intention to be a friendly person. I have to be inviting, I have to be polite. But maybe that unconsciously, and my body does something like withdrawing movement, a slight withdrawing movement, or a declining movement, so to speak. And here we would have a clear example of a contradictory field. The field is characterized by one intention on the conscious level of being inviting, of being polite, of being connecting with the other, whereas my bodily behavior contradicts this tendency and would be a movement that for another person signals, okay, this person, he doesn't really want to be connected, to be inviting. I think this could well be visible in one's bodily movements, certainly.
Thank you very much. Well, we take 4 minutes of the break, so I think it's time to take a break. Thank you very much, Thomas. Please remember that if you have some questions remaining, you can send them by email for the last discussion at Friday. So see you at in 12 minutes of break.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Okay, we are on time. So now it's a great pleasure to present Christine Caldwell from Naropa University, United States. She is the founder of and professor emeritus in the somatic counseling program at Naropa University, where she taught somatic counseling, clinical neuroscience, research, and diversity issues. You are now with your open mic.
Hello, everyone. I'm being heard?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Just to say, this morning I had extensive internet problems and missed most of Tomas's and Sabina's presentations. So I'm hoping that my internet connection will stay secure for my presentation. So I'd like to begin by thanking the people who have invited me to the Congress and who have made the event possible. My special appreciations go out to Camila Valenzuela and Maria Isabel Gaete Celes, and to the Instituto de Sistemas Complejos. These last few years have been challenging, and I'm honored to be a part of this research group, a group that has navigated 2019 and 2020 with grace and courage in the midst of substantial difficulties. And I want to apologize in advance for the number of slides. There's too many for the time allotted, and so I'm going to skip over several of them, thinking that if any of you want a copy of the slideshow, you can see where the topic might go if we had time. So my talk today looks at language, in particular the way we experience and language, how experience and language relate to one another. Perhaps by understanding this relationship between experience and language more deeply, we can grasp how ongoing sensory motor processes can be a personal encounter or participation with events, and that this encounter first produces a kind of language, a method of structured communication that uses wordless action to form the basis of verbal wording. So I'm interested in how this whole process creates our, excuse me, our embodied identities. So I'd like to suggest that we start with an event. There are likely an infinite number of events going on all the time, but our biology restricts us in terms of what we can apprehend. For example, physics tells us that there is a spectrum of light, but our senses can only pick up a portion of it. No infrared and ultraviolet light for our eyes. This points us toward Maturana and Varela's notion that we are not capable of perceiving reality, but only that which our senses can register. Life filters out events via the structure of our bodies, creating a kind of basic human identity built on what we can or can't sense directly. This may also have something to do with Tomas's idea of unconscious that he just presented. We have human senses, and our senses make us human. We make the world with our bodies. At the same time, movement occurs. Sensing is an act of moving, and moving constitutes our definition of being alive, our breathing, our heartbeat, our brain waves. In humans, sensing is an electrochemical type of moving. one that stimulates other types of bodily movements that define and shape our participation with the event. Again, biology limits movement so that only some directions and speeds, efforts, and shapes are possible. This creates a basic human identity based on how we can and can't move. Our movement makes us human, and our humanity makes us move in certain ways. We make the world as we move. So sensing and moving initiate and shape the process of experiencing. As we noted before, a synonym for the word experiencing is making the world. First, experiencing makes a human world, and as it goes on, it weaves a more and more specific and personal one. Sensing and moving begin unconsciously, and in most cases stay in the unconscious realm. For instance, our bodies sense move that the level of a certain hormone is low and send signals to an organ to secrete more in order to maintain physiological balance. That whole procedure never rises to our conscious awareness, thank goodness. If we had to monitor all that stuff consciously, we would never be able to get out of bed in the morning. Consciousness is metabolically expensive, so evolution has compelled us to save it for processing sensory motor experiences that need more sophisticated and adaptive participation. This goes along with the findings of neuroscience that the main function of the nervous system is to eliminate information. Life is a process of filtering. All experiences are a series of filtered events. When sensing and moving with an event becomes conscious, perception occurs. The word perceive comes from a Greek root meaning to grasp or take hold of. As Merleau-Ponty has told us, it is the body in motion that perceives. It is the body insofar as it is capable of action that is the basis of perception. Likely at the same time, attention works to bring some perceptions into the foreground while others are backgrounded. We categorize before and during the perceptive act, further filtering our experience so that we can dance with what remains in a more sophisticated way. Here we begin to actively choose a world, largely based on previous experiences rather than genetic inheritances. It is this attentional choosing that many meditative practices seek to focus and clarify. The capacity to work consciously with attentional processes so that our sensory motor filters can more reflect the present moment rather than past proclivities. Our experience, our sensing and moving with the event becomes further elaborated, sharpened, and vivid with conscious attention. We become more capable of active participation with the chosen event in a dance of mutual and ongoing shaping. Just like the ongoing feedback loop of sensing and moving, perceiving and attending also interact like two sides of the same coin, working alongside each other as a means of creating a more elaborate world. Creating, as Merleau-Ponty would say, the flesh of the world, the felt dimension of experience. As a psychotherapist in practice for about 40 years, it's my belief that what we call mental illness resides in disturbances of the sensing, moving, perceiving, attending feedback loops. And that working with these loops directly through the body enables healing to occur. In this sense, what we call psychotherapy works most efficiently with the structure of experience more than the contents of experience. But that's material for another talk on another day. So the next phase of this diagram, I'm still thinking through, so I look forward to feedback from all of you about this. it seems to me that the act of participating with an event, also called having an experience, is somehow fundamentally different than completing with that experience and moving on to a new one. The model that I'm considering comes from mechanical physics, where it talks about how energy works. It charges, then it discharges. Another way to put it is that an experience fills us and then it empties out of us, often leaving some whispered traces called memories, much like how the lungs upon exhaling never quite empty. I see an experience as first charging us up, moving us, changing our state and what we do within that state via sensing, moving, and perceiving, attending. The second phase of an experience can then be seen as an emptying, a discharging of what has occurred in the experience that doesn't need to be retained, much like the digestive process. This also follows the principles of Buddhism, which teaches us to empty ourselves of distracting states, states that we are clinging to. It also creates a model for how psychotherapy understands emotional processing. An emotion comes, we move and are moved by it, and then it goes, ideally, with wisps of emotional memory left behind. Another analogy can be taken from how neurons and other cells operate. They charge, then discharge, then have a short refractory period, and then they fire again. The discharge phase is what I would like to explore because it's my feeling that this is our first moment of what we might call language. Okay, these are some of the slides I'm going to skip. There we go. So this discharge phase I will call expressing. The word comes from the Latin meaning to press out. Expressing connotes a kind of one-way street, an experience being discharged outwards from the organism into the environment. My sense is that this is a limited and dualistic view. More likely, an expression goes in all directions, radiating out from a locus somewhere in the body, so that the expression suffuses both the body itself and the space around the body. There is no hard distinction between the body and the environment. There are only degrees of influence radiating out from a locus like a wave. Recently, I was camping in southwestern Colorado in the United States. One evening, I was stung by a yellow jacket, which is a particularly aggressive and poisonous type of wasp. My yelling and reflexive moving was an immediate and highly expressive reaction to intense pain. These sounds and actions were an example of expression, one that I would have done had no one else been there. But my husband was there. I didn't have to tell him, "Husband, I have just been stung by a wasp and I am in intense pain." He got enough from the nonverbal and unverbalizable expressions that I was making to come running, which was a good start. So in communications theory, where they talk about all of us being senders and receivers of signals, an expression is seen as a fairly raw discharge of an experience. The sender expresses themselves directly without particularly considering the receiver or even needing a receiver. In communication, on the other hand, the sender actively shapes and adapts their expression into signals that the receiver can understand. In communicating, we effort to be understood. In communicating, so we take into account in communicating who the receiver is. Are they listening? Do they understand my mode of speech? Should I be using big words or small words? What mood are they in? So that we can connect to someone as we dance with our experiences. We may even tamp down our expressiveness so that we can be better understood. When I yelled and jumped after being stung, my husband immediately knew that I was in distress and he rushed over, but he didn't know how to help until I was able to calm down enough to say, "I've been stung by a wasp. There it is on the floor." Communication becomes real and meaningful when it initiates a shared experience between two or more organisms, one of whom goes over and stomps on the wasp. So I need to take a bit of a sidestep here and talk for a few minutes about the important role of, excuse me, attention in this process. One of the dictionary definitions of thinking is one's mind or attention. This brings us to the idea that thinking does not have to be with words, but can be an act of selecting and giving energy to experiential contents. The Zen Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh was fond of saying that attention is like sunlight and water to a plant. What you pay attention to will grow. Another way of saying it is that attention is an act of giving metabolic energy to an experience as a fuel that can initiate the process of reflection. In mechanical physics, it is said that one must either add or subtract energy from a system in order to change it. This may point us to the role of attention, both in its unconscious and conscious iterations, in ongoing experience, and in the emergence of wording. By withdrawing attention from an experience, we diminish its hold on us. By pouring our attention into an experience, we can feel it more acutely, play with it expressively, and shape something coherent for our own and others' knowledge. So where in this process does language begin? It depends, of course, on how we define language, how we define word, the word. The Bible tells us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. So clearly, the Abrahamic God feels that language comes in right away. Even though I'm not an Abrahamic type of person, this is an intriguing and powerful statement, worthy of a good bottle of wine in an evening during a discussion with friends. Words are typically seen as a single element in speech or writing, and here is where we can all pivot to a more broad understanding of word. And we can begin to ask how our bodies might generate their own type of words as they transition from expressing themselves to communicating to themselves and others. Perhaps when the Word was made flesh, it became so because someone used it to initiate a shared experience with another, which, because we are social mammals, feels good and ensures our survival. Words are not only embedded in speech or written language. A word is made flesh in the midst of an ongoing experience as it evolves into an expression and then perhaps into a communication. As our bodies continue to move with an experience, these increasingly elaborated movements form words. The moving body is wording. At some point later, it may even speak in tongues. So language begins when we shape our experience into an understandable and relatable form. This shaping, as was noted above, is the body's doing. The body begins to refine movement into more precise detail, shaping things like speed, rhythm, use of space, amount of effort, similar to what Sabina was talking about earlier, so that the signal becomes more coherent to self and others, a kind of precise and detailed speaking that invites listening. I find this word coherency fascinating and feel that helping the client to generate a more to generate more coherent signals may be a way to operationalize the process of psychotherapy and perhaps medicine. More on that some other time. For now, let's say that these increasingly coherent movements and the sensations that ride along with them can be called body narratives. The body, in the throes of an experience, will begin to narrate its experience in an effort to know and be known. As Maturana and Varela said, every act of knowing brings forth a world. Experiencing an event can stay largely personal as a self-expression that creates a more private or simple level of coherency. But when we want a more nuanced and profound sense of coherency and connection, we need to shape our embodied experience so that it communicates in a powerful and detailed way. It touches our inner being and it touches others in a way that increases both knowledge and understanding. It radiates out from a locus like a wave. I would like to suggest that within these coherency producing moments, we experience identity formation. And I am having this experience. This experience is an act of me knowing myself. When we can send and receive coherent signals in the form of body narratives, we generate a body identity. I formulated this idea of body narratives and body identity as a way to explain what happens in an embodied psychotherapy session, and have written about it in other publications. In this short time, I will just say that I've drawn from the concept of narrative identity, which holds that our identity is formed from the stories we tell about ourselves and the stories that others tell about us. By extending these ideas into the embodied realm, we can say that the body narrates stories of its experiences through sensing and moving and attending to the ongoing unfolding of the experience as it comes and goes. Ongoing open attention gives energy to this system and allows an expressive or communicative narration to form, one that then shapes coherent identities. Our identities, however, are multiple, ongoing, and subject to change via further coherency generating experiences. Our identities aren't fixed, in other words. For some odd reasons, humans seem to want to talk about their experiences with body narratives as well as auditory or written utterances, working to generate waves of coherent connection. Experience is not so much abstracted from in this process as it is filtered and shaped into language, which is its own type of experience. For this reason, I want to stop using the words verbal and nonverbal. Besides demeaning the body's language by defining it via what it is not, nonverbal, the body experiences we are researching are simply communicating in their own different types of words, putting together sensory motor sentences and paragraphs, and emerging with fully self-realized and self-identified narratives that form the basis of our ongoing, multiple, and adaptive identities. We don't put words to our experience. It's just that words are, what words are evolves developmentally. I think I'll say that again. We don't put words to our experience. It's just that what words are evolves developmentally. Yes, body narratives predate spoken and written language developmentally, but body narratives never go away. As we develop, we just become capable of using more and more channels of communication, body narratives, speech, writing, art, and so on. All of these channels can and should be used as research lenses so that our subsequent knowledge encompasses more human experiencing. This is just, again, a quick idea of a kind of a continuum of wording or narratives that perhaps if someone wants to ask a question about it, we can go there. This is something about the development of written and spoken language. And I think there's, again, an equivalent wording that happens in the body. And we can, here I'm just showing about some of these equivalencies in terms of body language development that doesn't involve the kind of what we might call speech or written utterances. For instance, there's a sense of poetic language being very different than regular spoken language that is fun to talk about. So the event, the event, then experience, then express, then communicate process is cyclical. However, I should have done the slide in a cyclical way. Or perhaps it forms waves. Events run through biological filters to generate experiences, which create expressions of these experiences, which then may be worth the effort of creating coherent communications, which in turn enable further events to be experienced. In this dance, identity rises and falls, becoming more coherent and solid, then breaking down in the face of new events that are experienced in states of open attention. This is a mobility gradient that I play with quite a bit in my work that, again, we could talk about another time. I also want to pull in at some point Elizabeth Benke's work. She speaks to a lot of what I've been talking about. There's a way that we can understand all of these movement practices as refining our ability to be coherent, both to ourselves and to each other. And some of that has been mentioned previously. But again, this can all map onto different research practices that perhaps we can talk about in discussion. And again, I'm very interested in this idea of bodily-based research and interested in how this whole process of event and body narratives particularly can be used in a qualitative interview experience. So I just want to, I hope also that today my auditory utterances have moved you in some way so that we engaged in some shared experiences, ones that fostered greater coherencies and a deeper knowing of the world that we create. So thank you very much. And I'd be happy to share this PowerPoint with everyone as we go along. Okay.
Thank you very much, Christine, for that. I really appreciate that you brings forward the role of language that has been an important part of our discussions in the research network during the last years. And I think it does justice to the idea of words becoming flesh. I like that notion, and it broadens the view of to different forms of language and not just narrative or only verbal. So I think it's a very, very important part of the whole discussion of this conference, the role of language, both in research, psychotherapy, and how our bodily experience can takes part of it, and yes, all the very complex relationship that there is in.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. I don't see any question in the chat. So it seems that you are a little lazy or, or cansados. How can I say it? Oh, cansados. No. But I open the questions if some would like to ask something.
Jorge
because
Soto has a question.
Who?
Jorge Soto.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your talk, first of all. I have a following question regarding this metaphor that communication is transmission of information. Wouldn't you question it if, especially if you are really in the spirit of embodied cognition? Because in fact, this, I would say this metaphor is quite alien to Maturana's and Varela's viewpoint regarding structural coupling, cognition as in action. So really, do you have maybe another insight or further insight regarding this, this description of communication?
Yes, I'm sorry, outside the door, my dog is barking crazily, and I had trouble really deeply attending to what you were asking. I'll have to say that I'm not as familiar with embodied cognition as I would like to be. So what I would say though is that I go from the tradition that that I was first introduced to by Siegfried Frey, who is was at the University of Duisburg. And he was a communications theorist. And so this understanding of communication is based sort of in that area of research, particularly this, again, this area of signals, and when signals are coherent and incoherent, who has the power to determine whether a signal is understood or not, the receiver or the sender. So it comes from a different tradition. And I think, Jorge, you might actually have a better idea than I do about how it may create a tension with embodied cognition. You know, one of the things that I get really interested in is how we use words and how words are defined in a certain way, and then they're just kind of solidified or ossified, fossilized in a certain kind of meaning. And a lot of my talk is trying to upend the way we use certain words, like, well, the way we use the word, right? The way we use the word communication, the way we use narrative or narrating. So I'm probably doing that again. I'm upending something there. And it comes from my belief that really we are, in a sense, all and only body, and that our mind, our cognition is just something that our body does. It's our body doing something. And just like it digests and respirates, and it also thinks. And so the body thinks as well. That would be one way to also contextualize what I was saying.
Okay, we have really a few time remaining, so we have to move to the other questions. Sebastián Medeiros, you'd like to say something? A commentary, a question?
Yes, thank you, Christine, for your presentation. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts regarding the intention or motivation or heart quality beneath words, beneath speech, you know? Thinking about intentions toward connections or separation. What do you think about that in this
Yes.
approach?
And I would have to say that the first thing that occurred when you started to ask this question was my sort of socio-political context right now as a person in the United States, as a person living and born here, that there's a lot going on, particularly in the socio-political context, about the difference between the sender and the receiver. In other words, the sender didn't intend to offend this African-American person, for instance. This white person didn't intend to offend them, but they did offend them. And the offense, the power to be offended, is with the African-American receiver. And so this is trying to sort of push back against some of the oppression that happens from dominant cultures to more oppressed cultures, where the dominant culture, the culture that has power, has the power to interpret intention and to impose intentionality onto the communicative process. And so I think this is a really interesting question from that perspective. But Frey, this German academic that I talked about, he also talked about intention as being, in many cases, in the power of the receiver to interpret, regardless of what the sender intended in the communication. So I think it's a very tender topic. It is fraught with power dynamics. And one of the things that I get interested in is watching how this plays out on the body level, on the level of bodily movement. So for instance, I can touch someone with an intention of affection or empathy or caring or connection. But because of their background, let's say they have a trauma background, I touch them and they feel invaded, they feel frightened, they feel that they are under attack. And, you know, what we could call, you know, who's right is meaningless there. It's literally meaningless.
Okay, we must move forward. There's no room for more commentaries. So I would like to go with the question of Claudia Silva. Would you like to make it by yourself, Claudia?
Okay. Hello, thank you very much, Christine. Well, I am really intrigued about your approach in psychotherapy through movement. I don't know if you could share with us kind of a little bit.
Yeah, what I get very interested in from the standpoint of healing or psychotherapy is the idea of what I would call completed movement sequences. Or we could say giving the body a voice and allowing the body to generate coherent body narratives that are healing. You know, Freud, though he didn't use the term himself, talked, you know, Freudian work is called the talking cure. And I would say I'm interested in the moving cure. In other words, that the body narrative, the bodily experience of events and the traces that they leave in the body in the form of body memory are really important to be worked with very directly and very consciously. So in my work, I'll do some of it tomorrow in the workshop. But the idea is you bring your attention toward the body, you focus your attention in a very open and non-analytic way. What begins to emerge are different sensations and what I call micro movements. And these actually, in terms of Tomas's work with the unconscious that he just talked about, I'm thinking that micro movements are a way for us to understand that kind of horizontal dimension that he talked about, where the unconscious can become conscious. So that I really work with what different kinds of sensory associations and emotional associations arise, and then how do they literally move us, and making that movement conscious and allowing it to become a body narrative that fully sequences. And this produces that kind of very effective discharge, so that the meaning making, a new kind of meaning making can occur through the body.
Thank you, Christine. And there is a last question from Carmen Cordero. I don't know if you would like to ask it or I ask for you. It is about the notion of coherence. Yes.
Hola.
Hi, hola.
Gracias, Cristina.
De nada.
Quería preguntarte un poco acerca de la noción de coherencia. La noción de coherencia que manejas.
Permiso. Traducir en inglés. Sí, está bien ahora.
Sí. Okay, the notion of coherence. That's the idea that Carmen would like you to explain.
Entendiendo una relación de coherencia entre qué con qué, ¿no? O sea, ¿cómo miras con respecto de qué la coherencia, ¿no? Que de alguna manera me surge desde escucharte esta separación entre la cognición corporal y estas palabras, ¿no? O sea, es como que desde... Entonces, por eso quiero aclarar cómo lo ves, ¿ah? Porque como está esto de que desde la teoría de Maturana y Varela, ¿no? Esta circularidad que genera una cognición que va generando el propio mundo. En ese sentido, ¿ah? Es que digo respecto de qué son las coherencias, ¿ah? ¿Cuáles son las entidades que constituyen esta unidad coherente?
Yes. So thank you. That's, I think, a very important question, and it particularly excites me because I'm very, very taken with this word coherence. So thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk more about it. So I'd like to use two metaphors. One is our old experience of radios. And so you would turn on the radio and you would go to a station, and but you're not quite in tune, and all you hear on the radio is right. And that is there's still radio waves there. There are radio waves coming through, but they're not coherent. And then you turn the dial a little bit and you find a station, and then it says, hola, buenos días, mi nombre es da da da, and you understand the message. The message becomes coherent by that dial. The radio waves, they're still radio waves, right? They're all radio waves. But in one scenario, they're coherent, in another, they are incoherent. I'll take another metaphor from the body. So in the body, there's constant messaging going on between different tissues and different organs. And so the liver communicates with the pancreas, the stomach communicates with the limbic system of the brain. And one of the theories in medicine about what illness is that one part of the body, let's say the liver, is sending an incoherent message to, let's say, the digestive system. So the liver is saying, I need this. The digestive system can't interpret that message coherently. And so the relationship between the liver function and the digestive function breaks down and illness occurs because the interconnected parts of the system aren't coherent to each other. There's not a way that their communications are received and understood and then therefore responded to correctly. And so this is something that I get very interested in terms of how a client and a therapist relate to one another, and also how the client's movement literally can be coherency generating.
Okay, we have to stop now. We are on time, but first of all, I would like to thank you, Christine, for mentioning the work of 2 years preceding this conference. In that context, I would like to thank our panelists, Sabine, Thomas, and you, Christine, for their generous collaboration during the work of this research network, and invite you to continue this journey, this embodied journey tomorrow with the attractive workshops that are available. So I also invite you to say, to give greetings to Camila Valenzuela, because today is her birthday. So maybe we can give her a round of applause or sing happy birthday. So, yes, very, very happy birthday.
¡Feliz cumpleaños!
And it is a very, very...
Felicidades. Let's sing.
Felicidades, Camila.
Feliz cumpleaños.
Feliz cumpleaños.
I think it is a very good birthday because today we are consolidating the work of the network, and today we also officially give birth to our Laboratorio de Fenomenología Corporal. So the birthday of our lab will be the same of Camila. So this is another good news to celebrate. So thank you very much for your attention. I don't know if I forget something, Camila, to say.
Look at the posters for tomorrow's poster session.
Okay. Thank you very much for your thoughtful and motivate participation. See you tomorrow.
And we have the tomorrow.
Te deseamos a ti. Que los cumplas.
Mañana descorchamos champán. No, el
viernes.
Friday. Bye.
Thank you very much. And tomorrow the same link, the same Zoom link.
Thank you.
It's coming tomorrow.
Bye, Cam.